you for all of you who have dialed in to this discussion on disabilities inclusion. And the first thing I want to say about this is that some people have commented on, is there not a typo on this, this slide, as it says possibility? And then people needed to take a second look and say, maybe it's not a typo. And I am suspecting it is not. But that's actually something that might start us off right into the discussion with Jessica Mayer. And before I turn it over to Jessica, I just wanted to say it's such a pleasure to have this conversation hosted by Jessica. I've come to know her over, I don't know how many years now, Jessica, we'll leave that for later. But as not just an activist and an advocate for disabilities inclusion, but also just a person I have learned from a lot over the years around what that topic entails, the intersectionality of it all. And it's really a big pleasure to have Jessica lead us in this conversation. So thank you, Jessica, and I'll turn it right over to you now.
Thank you so much for having me today. Do not adjust your screen. I really do move like this a little bit, but bear with me. I have cerebral palsy if anybody is interested, and how my disability affects me is more in the lines of small motor coordination skills. So I speak a lot better than I type. I have trouble reading because my eye muscles don't coordinate well together either. So I listen better than I read. So if you tell me something, the chances of me remembering it are very high. If I read it, not so much. So be careful what you tell me. So anyway, this is embracing the world of possibilities, because people with disabilities are more than their disability. What I mean by that is people with disabilities have contributed a lot to the world. And let's get right into the statistics. Please show me the first slide. Okay, first of all, October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. This began as a project, I think, many years ago. I forgot what date it was. And it started because people with disabilities are grossly under and unemployed, but we'll get to that statistic later. Next slide. There are 54 million people with disabilities living in the United States here. There's 1.3 billion people. That's actually, it's around 1 billion, 1.3 billion people worldwide. And about 60% of the people in the United States with disabilities are unemployed. 70% of people with severe disabilities are unemployed. Next slide, please. 78% of people of color with disabilities are unemployed, and 55% of college graduates are unemployed, and 60 million people in the U.S. alone will have a psychiatric disability at some point in their lives, either a depressive episode. And after the pandemic, we've all, I think, had, you know, our dose of psychiatric problems and issues that have come up for many people because loneliness and isolation does that to people. So we can't ignore this issue anymore. And actually, a few days ago was Psychiatric Disability Mental Health Awareness Day was a few days ago, and here in the U.S. I don't know whether or not other countries have days dedicated to certain issues like that, but I'm sure that somebody will tell me. Next slide, please. Okay, and with that being true that the numbers are so high, we have $1 trillion of aggregate income, $200 billion worth of disposable income. That's pretty cool, isn't it? You know, and everybody will age at some point. Everybody gets to a place in their lives when they have a disability. So it's better that we deal with certain things now than later. Next slide, please. Okay. And the reason why we have, and these numbers are only increasing due to increase in premature birth survival rate, aging baby boomers, and medical advancements. People with disabilities have lived longer now than they've ever lived before. People are aging better and they're aging at home. That's a whole nother side of disability awareness that we talk about, which is aging at home or aging in place. And premature survival rates and multiple birth survival rates have gone up, whereas kids with, like, even my disability wouldn't have survived because they were premature, even though I wasn't. That their survival is much higher now than it was before. And medical advancements. Christopher Reeve would have never lived as long as he did without the advancements of medicine. And also, people with cancer want to work. People with all kinds of illnesses want to work. You know, so it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with as we move forward. Next slide, please. And here we really do get to some of the good stuff. Like, when we talk about people with disabilities, we always talk about people with disabilities as a negative, as somehow a drain on society, as something that we people are afraid of the unknown kind of thing. And when we do that, we miss out on the good stuff when it comes to disability, because we often say necessity is the mother of all invention. So if necessity is the mother of all invention, we have to remember that people with disabilities have given us so much, like closed captioning, originally intended for the hearing impaired. Now it's used in bars and restaurants and any place that we go where there are loud noises. We usually use closed captioning. The typewriter was invented as a communication device for somebody with visual impairment. With a visual impairment, they would be able to type letters to a person who lived in another state where they couldn't write them. A visually impaired person couldn't write them. Also, photographs were partially invented as a reading to read books to people with visual impairment. Next slide, please. Curb cuts were initially intended for people with mobility impairments and wheelchair access, but now they're used as an everyday device for strollers and luggage and anything on wheels. Scanners, the original flatbed scanner that Kurzweil invented was originally intended to read books to people with visual impairments. Also, voice activated software was originally intended for people with visual impairments and people who had difficulty using their hands. And good grips, the utensils were originally intended for people with arthritis and other impairments to use your hands. So when we think about disability, now we also have a program called Speechify, which has recently come out. And it's really meant, it was really, I think, originally intended for people with dyslexia who had trouble reading, and they could read along with the verbal interpretation of Speechify, which is a program where you can scan something with your phone and it will read it to you. And it's a great thing. It's a great tool for people to have if they either don't want to read or they're working out and then they have work to do. There's a lot of reasons. Also, audibles came out of people not being able to read very well, and also a lot of things that we use come because people with disabilities have really been able to make it possible. So when we think about disabilities, let's think of the inventive side, the world of possibilities, and let's stop thinking about disability as a drain. Because what I believe to be true is that people with disabilities are some of the most creative, inventive people I've met. So I guess when we stop thinking about disability as oh my God, I have to accommodate somebody, and start thinking about them as, where is my next new invention going to come from, and where am I going to go with it? So I'm going to next slide, please. And that's really the end of my slide presentation. And I wanted to talk a little bit about fears around people with disabilities, and if there's any questions around anxiety, fears, because a lot of folks just don't know what to say and don't know what to do around folks with disabilities. So, think about the people with disabilities in your life too, who are close to you, with family members and friends, and think about what they contribute to your life instead of what you needed to do for them. So,
what a great question, actually, to all of us. And we'll give people a moment to type in any questions they might have or reactions. But let's get into, like you said, a little bit of dialogue about this. And what I really appreciate, and you started off with that, is simply the fact that there is a huge employment gap in the population that is generally classified as disabled, and yet there are so many important and significant culture-shaping innovations that come from this population, or that are somehow connected to this population. And there is a real paradox here, right? Why don't we focus on employ more people with disabilities when so much positive and opportunities are generated, in terms of innovation and so forth. And I know that you speak a lot about myths, right? That get in the way for people. Maybe that's a good segue into just talking a little bit about some of the myths that exist around people with disabilities that get in the way of actually, seeing the strong advantages that we create when we create organizations that are inclusive of people with disabilities.
I think one of the biggest myths is that for some reason people are thinking that people are running around finding jobs, with disabilities, looking for jobs that they can't do. Like a blind bus driver. For some reason, people think, that somebody who's blind is going to really, look for a bus driving position. And I have no idea where this came from, because I think it's the opposite of that. It's kind of like, people looking at jobs, and women do this too. And this is another intersection between jobs and what people with disabilities can do. And I think when people apply for jobs, it's just the opposite of that. I think that what happens is you look at a job description, you decide what you can do, or what you can't do. And, there are all these lists of job qualifications. There's somebody at my door, so excuse me for 1 second.
So while Jessica is is just taking care of that, perhaps we can collect some questions that we can actually ask when she comes back and explore this a little bit. And thank you for their 2 questions that have come in. Just think about your own questions, and also think about what Jessica asked us. What do people with disabilities, what have they added in our lives? And I can maybe ask that or answer that a little bit. That for me, a number of people with disabilities that have just demonstrated to me what it means to what accessibility means, actually. And Jessica, I was just talking a little bit about your question about what have you learned from people with disabilities, and I can link that to a question that came in. And the question is simply, what can we as individuals do to make the world around us more accessible? And I was just reflecting on my own learning from people with disabilities, namely around accessibility, how important accessibility is, and how I am oftentimes not aware of the accessibility needs that other people might have.
Well, if you're in a business, you should always write. And this was something I wanted to tell yours, is that when you do these spotlights, what we should do is, and I should have told you this a long time ago, you should write down any accommodations needed. Like if somebody needs a sign language interpreter, what language, how can, there's also audio description now that people sometimes say, I'm a white woman with wearing glasses, with red hair, wearing a blue flowered short, with short red hair. So there's a lot of things that you can say that we can help people with disabilities, in terms of even a webinar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's also accessibility, website accessibility, and I'm not really technical, so it's hard for me to say what website access is, but it means open captioning of certain of the webinar, of certain videos that you have up. It means to do audio description. It means to have mouse overs, which are things that blind people don't use a mouse, like a mouse. They use, or mouse pad, they use their up and down keys. So, and a lot of pictures are visually described or described in where it comes out as speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So here are a few other questions that have come in. So, and I'll just read it out the way it is here. Would you comment on the dynamic of visible disabilities versus disabilities that you cannot see? And what are some of the challenges and recommendations to think about and engage with? I think that's a critical distinction that we probably need to talk about.
Well, visible disabilities are very different than invisible disabilities. Invisible disabilities people don't have to speak about normally. But the issue is that if you have a seizure disorder and if you haven't told your employer about it, and if one day you have a seizure, then you're going to run into a problem because your employer isn't going to know what to do. So the question is, how do we get people to be not so ashamed of their disabilities, or even if they're not ashamed of it, how do we get society to be more open to people with invisible disabilities? So if you are having a psychiatric disability and you change your medication or something, and you're really acting out at work, and you get fired, then you come back and you say, well, I have a psychiatric disability. It's really not fair to the employer either. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how do we get society to not make it so shame-based?
So what have you found is, if we talk about this a little bit, because there is shame, there is also when you have a visible disability, and we talked about this actually in a different piece around that. Essentially, your vulnerability is fully on display when it's a non-visible disability. You can hide and cover it, right? And those are totally different psychological dynamics. And yet we need to create safety, right? And I mean psychological safety, not just physical safety. That takes that shame away a little bit.
I think the more we talk about mental health, diabetes, heart disease, whatever those disabilities are, the better that we're going to be. And I think if one thing the pandemic has shown us is that disability has really, especially psychiatric disability, has really moved to the forefront because people had major triggers, had people die, had people, going to the hospital. We were all isolated. So children are, the loneliness factor shot up. So I really think that we need to just talk about it more and have this conversation around mental health, because, everybody got a mental health, regardless of whether or not you're psychiatrically disabled or not. Everybody gets depressed, everybody gets sad. So
we need to normalize that a little bit, right? I mean, and I think this is a really important lesson that we share. The things that affect us, right? And without necessarily, needing a formal classification of an ability or disability, we can just share oftentimes what concerns us and have conversations that
Right,
normalize
like
this, right?
checking in with your employees, making sure that they're okay. You know, especially with this virtual world now that we live in, just check in and say, how you doing today? Just checking in on everybody, especially if you're a supervisor.
Mhm.
You know, how are you doing? Forget about work just for a few minutes, you know, just checking in.
And this is actually really interesting because another question that came in had to do with language. How do we talk about disabilities, you know, in a sense? And I think this is where a lot of people may find, I mean, it's already difficult sometimes to talk about diversity related topics, you know, for many people, and that get very anxious and nervous in the workplace. So in the pursuit to create more inclusive work environments, many people are actually shying away from the conversation about it, you know. So it's a bit of a paradox, I feel, when we're doing this work of diversity oftentimes. But specifically around disability, what are some of the traps? That's really the question that we fall into when talking about disabilities. And what recommendations might you have when we have this this conversation, or we're trying to reach out, but we are nervous about offending or saying something that is not appropriate, or any such topics?
Assumptions. Don't make any assumptions. Assumptions of like talking to an adult like they're a child, you know, like making like going up to a blind person and grabbing their hands and saying, wow, we're walking this way, pushing somebody in their wheelchair. Don't make any assumptions without asking first. And it's always about relationship building. You know, it's on a need-to-know basis. Like, I know that sometimes, in a way, I've gotten VPs to give lunch, to carry lunch for me because I can't carry it myself, or I do panels sometimes, and I've gotten people like really top executives to carry stuff for my panelists, like coffee, because my hand shakes so much, and they're usually men. And I always ask the guys to do it, you know. So it's funny how those dynamics change when you ask somebody to do something who is not usually asked to do that kind of stuff. So, you know, quote unquote, a menial task. So, you know, I actually felt like even when we're talking, you're doing writing for me a lot of the time, yours. And it's always a very uncomfortable position for me because they need you to do it. But sometimes I feel like I'm the one who should be doing it because you're the client, you know? So I should be the one that's writing it, but I can't. So, you know, and you know that because of our relationship. And I told you, you know, that you're gonna have to do some writing for me if we're going to work together. And it's an uncomfortable position, but you don't seem to mind. And that has always made me feel very included with your organization. It's just something that you naturally do.
So it's paying attention, right? To but it also takes you in this case, or anybody, to be open about it, right? To express
Yeah,
your needs and then, you know, figure out how can we meet that need, right? And and I think that's why the question is so important, how we talk about these things, because who asks, you know, who says, who expects. And there is a whole field of tension that I think many
right.
people don't know how to navigate, especially in
Well,
the workplace.
I think that people with disabilities should do the asking, or if you're seeing somebody struggling with something, ask them, can I help you with it? You know, if you visibly see somebody like really struggling to take notes at a meeting or something, say, can I do that for you? Are you struggling with that? You know, are you paying more attention to your notes than you are to the person who's speaking? Because the person who's speaking is more important than the notes at that
Mhm.
point. So I think if you see somebody struggle,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
if they say no, and that's fine. But you should always ask.
so this is actually interesting because I think in the workplace there are some accommodations that people make more readily than others, perhaps. And then there are also certain disabilities that seem to be embraced more than others. I mean, so what I hear, for example, a lot about neurodiversity at the moment,
Mhm.
and employing people on the spectrum, essentially, because there are clear strengths that they are representing and bringing to the business. Maybe as another example of innovation and so forth. Actually, since you gave all these examples earlier, but you know, but it seems to me that not all disabilities are treated equally in a business context, and that there is a hierarchy of disabilities, because it's a big label, right? It's a big label that we use.
I think, to me, it's there's a hierarchy of disabilities, like people with mobility impairments. Yeah, there is a hierarchy of disability, and I really can't talk about which ones are higher and which ones are lower on the totem pole. I know that people with neurodiversities are really coming into their own now, because it's such a technical world that we're living in. And also the fact that we are telecommuting so much these days, which is perfect for somebody on the spectrum, because for a large number of them, of people with autism, they like to be alone. That is where they feel more comfortable. So they're in their house, they're doing their computer work, thrilled.
Yeah, so in other words, there are many new opportunities for people with disabilities that we can create into our organization. We just
Right.
have to be conscientious about them, and therefore also recruit differently, perhaps, right? Or think
Yeah.
about our talent differently.
And we have to stop also saying that people with disabilities have limited abilities, and that we also have to think more broadly about years of experience and how many years of experience somebody has versus how many you can have 1 year. My friend Ron always said you can have 1 year of experience for 10 years in a row. It means literally nothing to have 1 year at the same job where you're doing the exact same thing year after year and having 10 years of experience in a place where you're growing. So, let's not have hard and fast rules about years of experience somebody has at doing something, whether or not they can do it, whether or not they can't do it, how can they figure it out? You can have people hired on a trial basis. They can do an apprenticeship for you, and I think that there are more creative ways of hiring people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in a sense, this can really innovate our hiring practices as well,
Right.
above and beyond checking for our own assumptions and biases that we are making. I think that's a really good advice, and especially in this hybrid virtual environment that opens up so many more opportunities.
Especially
go ahead.
for people with mobility impairments who may not be able to get to work, especially like during the winter. People have been asking to telecommute for years and always, we want you at work. Now, I know a bunch of offices that have closed because everybody works virtually now. My friend's daughter works for a company where she used to go in every day, and she's not a woman with a disability, and they totally closed the office. And it was only like 15 or 20 people. It was a small company, but they totally closed their office. Unless you're a doctor, if you're seeing patients, and even we're doing that more virtually now, you can do a cardiogram with 2 fingers now.
Yeah.
So it's amazing. It really is. You never really have to leave the house at that point.
Yeah.
Or your groceries delivered. I'm not saying that, but you really should leave your house because I think that's important too. But yes.
Yeah, I think there is a whole new world evolving right around these that give us different opportunities to engage people with disabilities, and also become more conscious of the world of possibilities, as you mentioned earlier, because it has been historically a real source of innovation. There is a question that came in about any specific recommendations or resources that you would point people to make events more accessible, or I should say the virtual workplace may be more accessible as well, given what you just mentioned.
Me, I can help you with that. No, let me see. There is the Job Accommodations Network, which is Jan, and events more accessible. Well, hire sign language interpreters, make people do audio descriptions about what they look like, make sure your place is accessible, have like, if you're gonna have tables set up, make sure that the tables are up so the wheelchair can fit under it. make sure that your what, if you're having like a drink place, where people are standing up, drink, before an event, make sure that you also have places where people can sit too, and people in wheelchairs can communicate, and have wider rows.
Yeah, so these are important resources, right? And maybe we can also put something online for the people that are asking for a specific resource. That's great. I'm looking at our time, and we have only a few more minutes left. If you have more questions, please type them in. We have a few more minutes. But Jessica, what given all that we covered, the importance of employment, because after all, this is Disability Employment Awareness Month, right? Given the importance of accessibility, given your own personal experience, what are some of the key messages you would leave us with?
Well, I would just leave you with the message that people with disabilities are smart, we're talented, and you're leaving out this enormous talent pool of people, and eventually, anybody can join these ranks at any point in your life. You're always one accident, one illness away from joining us. And I think that scares people to death. And I think that people are frightened by disability because they think it's the most awful thing in the world. And it's not.
Yeah.
It's not awful.
They see themselves, right, in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, for me, it's been my biggest teacher, my greatest friend, and my biggest enemy all at the same time. But life is more difficult, but it can be good too. Difficult and good are not mutually exclusive.
I love that. There is a question that came in, and thank you for sending it in. Given the challenge of disclosure, what do you think if a standard application question is, do you have a disability, or do you need any accommodations? If it was standard, then it might become less stigmatizing.
It's not a standard application question because I don't think it's legal. You can't, it has to be separated. Like you could ask somebody, are you disabled or you're not disabled? But it's for legal purposes only, and that needs to be put aside. That's only for somebody to keep track of people who are applying, when they ask about race, disability, ethnicity. Are you disabled? Are you not disabled? Do you want to answer this question? And so I don't think that's legal. But what you can ask is, can you perform the essential functions of this job with or without a reasonable accommodation? If the answer to that is no, then you shouldn't be applying for it. It's a very tricky little question, but always answer that question yes. Because
So in other words, I mean, these may not be the questions, but there are ways in which we can ask that normalizes that aspect, right? And if it were to become more normalized, then it becomes less stigmatizing as well.
No, it's like the same thing is that you can't ask what color somebody is, what their nationality is. It's the same thing. You really are not allowed to ask that before a job, before a conditional job offer is made.
Great.
Like you don't ask about age.
Yeah.
Because the same reason.
Yeah, and that might be very different. I mean, also, you know, based on the country we are in and the environment.
Based on the country,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And what's the last question?
That was here is, yeah, sorry, I didn't see this. But 1 second here. So I'm sure that I missed this, but what is a top thing to keep in mind when working with people with disabilities that is actionable? So that's actually, so you didn't miss it quite yet. So thank you for sending in the question, but an actionable thing that we need, that should be top of mind when working with people with disabilities.
Actionable. Let them take the lead. Make them feel comfortable. Let the person with the disability tell you what they need. There's really no action that obviously if you're in an inaccessible work environment, then you have to make it accessible. But from my perspective, treating people with dignity, respect, understanding, trying to learn is always thing that is kind of like, how do you greet somebody without a disability? How do you do? How do you greet somebody with a disability? How do you do? I mean, you know, maybe if you're talking to somebody in a wheelchair, you sit next to them so that they're not looking up at you. Little things like that. If you're speaking with a sign language interpreter, she always speaks to the person, not the interpreter. They're just there to interpret.
So maybe that's the top thing to keep in mind. What small acts what actions can I take? What can my behavior signal that makes it safe and respectful for the other person? And this is something that I learned from you, that you can really ask all of these things, and people will disclose all of these things if you build relationships, right? If you build relationships that create that psychological safety that we talk about a lot, and that's in our power, right? There is another follow-up question to the question earlier around what we can ask in a job interview, right? And you said we really can't ask this, but the question is, can an employer ask that after a job has been offered and accepted?
Yes, if you think that there's a need to do it. You know, if it's or you can ask it on to anybody, is there any accommodations that you might need going forward? I wouldn't stay away from, are you disabled types of questions, but is there an accommodation we can provide for you going forward? And in the United States, what we do is we have a way of, obviously, if you're in a wheelchair, then you're going to need wheelchair access. If you're deaf, you're going to need a sign language interpreter. If you're blind, then you go. But if you have a back injury or you need like a special chair, sometimes I've seen employers ask for doctors' notes that say things like need special chair, chair, ask for what's the word? I'm looking for a word and I can't find it. Ask for notification of your disability.
Yeah, that's good advice and good to keep in mind. And I just, because we are at time, so we'll close it out in a moment, but I just wanted for you to have, there is one person reflecting on your question from earlier. What have people with disabilities given you? You know, what have you learned? And there is one person here really resonated, saying that my experience with my mom's ALS was very informative to this experience and perspective. So to your point, you know, we're all affected by people with disabilities. We may look into our future with certain types, you know, as well, and that creates this particular connection and resonance with us. And it brings up complicated feelings and emotions. And we just need to have the courage sometimes to step into that.
Yes. And just because you run into complicated feelings and emotions with race, with religion, with sexual orientation and gender identity, we run into all kinds of emotional stuff with that.
That's right.
We cannot use that as an excuse not to hire somebody.
Yeah. And that is actually the thread that weaves itself through all kinds of diversity and equity and inclusiveness issues.
Right. So I think I'm going to end it on that high note. We can't use these things to, we used to think women can't be presidents of a corporation, even though a very small percentage are president of corporations. We used to think a lot of things about women because they were all getting pregnant, you know, and how can you run a corporation when you're out for maternity leave and you have child care issues? So, you know, and because we do, you know, because people can do all kinds of things if given the opportunity to do them.
Yeah, and we can all exercise that culture shifting powers in a sense, and that's a great reminder. So let's end on that note. Thank you all for dialing in and participating with your questions and raising, you know, your various issues and resonating with this topic tremendously, as we can see. You know, thank you, Jessica, for guiding us through this conversation. And more spotlight sessions next week, and more to come from Jessica as part of this institute. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, George.